Part of dealing with a death is dealing with paperwork, details, and legal issues. Lawyer Doris Bonora will be guiding us through what needs to be done so we can prepare. Doris, where do we start? What needs to be done right away when someone dies?
So the first step would be probably to try and locate the will so that you know who the executor is, because it is the executor who's in charge of everything, including planning the funeral. And so most people think they have to rush to the funeral home, but really they should figure out who the executor is, because in fact the funeral home will ask who the executor is, because it is the person who has what we call dominion over the body, and so they're to plan the funeral. Some people will also have instructions about their funeral in their will or with their will, and so if you want to make sure that you follow the person's instructions, then it's good to locate that will to make sure that that's in fact that you're going to follow the instructions they have.
And what if the person doesn't have a will?
Well, now you still have to plan the funeral right away. And so you have to go to the funeral home, and the funeral home will take instructions from what they consider the next of kin. So that would start with a spouse or a partner if there was one, and then move on to adult children or parents. The problem is that in our complicated families, the whole question of who is a spouse or a partner can be the most complicated question. Even at the funeral home, there can be those disputes if the person hasn't done a will. Ultimately, in order to manage someone's estate, there will need to be a court application to appoint an administrator where you haven't done a will to appoint an executor.
Wow, okay. And what's next?
The next step would be, after the funeral or in that process, is to cancel all the person's identifying information, so driver's licenses, passports, notifying banks, notifying Canada Pension Plan. And the reason we want to deal with that is because, unfortunately, there's a lot of fraud that happens when someone dies. So we want to make sure the bank knows that the person has died so that no one can show up there and try and take their money. And we want to cancel their identifying information so that it can't be copied by anyone who's fraudulent. After that, you can take a bit of a breath, because then the next steps in terms of trying to figure out whether you're going to probate the will or whether you're going to, and gathering in assets and distributing, that can take a bit more time. You don't have to rush through that process, although you want to proceed expeditiously.
You mentioned probate. What is that and how does it work?
So probate is the process where the court confirms that this is the will we're going to follow. And the problem is that if we don't know exactly what will we're going to follow, it causes lots of confusion. And so it used to be that you could sort of take the will, and an executor could take the will and go to the bank and say, hey, I'm the executor, pay me the money and I'll distribute it. The concern was, what if somebody else shows up the next day with another will, and now the bank's paid out under the first will. So banks take a very strict approach and say, I'm not going to pay to anyone unless they have probate, because in the probate process, someone will have to swear under oath that this is the only will there is. And in that process, everyone who has an interest in the estate will get notifications. So if there's a spouse or there's a common law partner, if there's a disabled child, well, and all the children will get notice of what's happening. And so then if they think there's another will or this isn't the will that should be followed, then something can happen to make sure that the proper will and the proper distribution takes place. So probate is basically a process that you go through in the court system to confirm that this is the will that's going to be followed. So once you get the grant of probate, then it's kind of like your admission ticket to be able to access the banks, transfer the house, do all of those things that you need to administer the estate.
How do you pay for someone's debts, their funeral, that sort of thing?
So lots of people are concerned about how to pay for the funeral, because you probably will not have immediate access to the banks, because usually you'll only get access to the banks after you get probate, and probate can take about 6 to 8 weeks to get done. But if you take the funeral bill to the bank will pay the funeral home directly. So they'll issue a bank draft. And that can be true of any other debts that are obviously the deceased. So the utility bills and his visa bill, all of those things the bank will pay directly as long as you can show that you have a will and you're the executor, you have a death certificate that's issued by the funeral home, and you can show them the debt that's an obvious debt of the deceased. So lots of families are concerned about those immediate debts, but you don't have to be worried about that. The bank will definitely take care of that. Then, as you move through the administration of the estate, once you have probate, then you'll have, as an executor, full access to the banks, and you'll be able to deal with all of the debts, including taxes and sort of those major debts that come in dealing with an estate.
You mentioned a death certificate. That's an important document, isn't it? Who provides that?
So the funeral home provides what's called a funeral director's statement of death, and that's all you need for anything you're going to do. So if you need to show the show the death certificate at the bank, or in order to transfer the house at the land titles office, you just need the funeral director's statement of death. There is a proper death certificate you can order from the province, and it costs $50, but you don't ever really need that because the funeral director's statement of death will get you through everything you need.
What if you've been selected as the executor of an estate that is insolvent and their debt exceeds their assets? What then?
I would say that you don't have to be the executor. Just because somebody chooses you doesn't mean you have to take on the task. So if you start and you see that this estate is in a complete mess and the debts exceed assets, so there will be no money left at the end of the day, I would suggest that you don't take on the role as the executor. So you can sign something called a renunciation and you can step out and not take on that task. An insolvent estate is just so problematic because you'll have to deal with all those creditors who are going to call asking for money. You still have to file tax returns, which means you have to find an accountant who's going to do it, but you'll have no money to pay the accountant. So it's really an estate that is a terrible problem. I would say generally it's good to know that if you are appointed as an executor, because some people are surprised, they're like, open the will and they didn't know they were going to be the executor. And if that executor feels like they can't take on the task for whatever reason, they absolutely have the right to resign. They don't have to take on the job if they don't want to.
Are there any other things that need to be done to wrap up an estate?
So you have to obviously gather in the money, and ultimately the beneficiaries want their money, so they have to be paid. That would be a big part of wrapping up the estate. In the process of wrapping up the estate, you do have to pay taxes. So there's a couple tax returns that have to be filed. Not necessary to really go into those details. Really, you just need to hire an accountant to get through that process. We're lucky in Canada that we don't have an inheritance tax, and so there isn't any special taxes that have to be paid as a result of death, but certainly that's a step in the process. The other thing an executor has to do is account to the beneficiary. So he has to say, well, here's all the money I found, here's all the debts I paid and money I paid out, and here's what I'm prepared to pay you. And ultimately beneficiaries have to sign off on that and say, yes, I'm satisfied and I'm happy to receive what you're about to pay me, or they might go to court about that and fight about what has happened in the administration of the estate and let a court decide it. Hopefully they wouldn't have to do that.
Thank you so much, Doris.